Hey everybody, it's Charles, your hobby hero, coming at you today with a video breaking down an 80-person event at CM Games with a full meta breakdown, including top 8 deck lists. But before we get started, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button down in the bottom corner. I do appreciate it. I do put out regular content about the hobbies that I love the most, with this channel being dedicated to the card games that I play. Now, this particular event was a huge event with a total of 80 participants playing for a $2,000 cash prize. Now, what I really enjoy is they actually included a full breakdown of representation of the ink color combinations. We won't see all the deck lists, but it's nice to see what kind of decks actually showed up to the event rather than just seeing what topped 8, because you never know if a deck is there in a very high number and it sees a high number of representation in the top 8 list, it may throw off people's perceptions of how good that deck actually is. So we do get to see the full breakdown with some surprises in there as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into those lists. All right, so here is the full meta breakdown for the constructed 2K event at CM Games. We'll go into the top 8 deck lists after this, but I want to look at kind of the representation of each of these decks in the meta, because there were some surprises in here for me. Just to kind of go in there, like obviously we know kind of the two front runners right now are our Ruby Amethyst builds and our Steel Amber builds. I was surprised to see them this prevalent. I mean, we've got almost 50% of the players, was at 33 players out of 80 players playing 2 decks. But we really want to look at like the representation in the top 8. I think Ruby Amethyst showed very well, even being 17 of the decks in the list. And I think Steel Amber performed very poorly for being number 2 on the list. We have our third most popular deck, which is a surprise to me, being the Steel and Sapphire combination. I think this was probably a reaction to the Steel Song decks that have been popping up. I think it is a very favorable matchup for this deck. However, I guess they maybe cannibalized themselves in this tournament, because we did not see any of the traditional Steel Song in the top 8 lists, and we saw no combination of Sapphire and Steel in the top 8. The Amethyst Emerald decks have been popping up here lately, with only 8 decks in the whole tournament, 2 of them top 8'd, so it performed better than expected. This color combination of Sapphire and Amethyst, I really have not seen much of. I've played against some random copies of this color combination, but to see 6 in the field was a bit surprising to me. None of the list top 8'd, so I'm not sure exactly what list they were playing. And then red-green here with 4 copies and 1 copy in the top 8. Some of the other surprises here, though, as we get down here, we have the Amber and Emerald with only 1 copy represented, and the Steel Amethyst list down here with only 1 copy represented. In my testing, these 2 decks have been one of the most consistent color performing decks that I have. So surprised to see their representation of basically 1 deck each in the tournament. Now, I don't know what deck list they ran. Neither of these 2 lists managed to top 8, but just surprised to see one of, I mean, especially the Amber Emerald. This deck continues to be a very easy deck to pilot, so very forgiving to newer players, but just consistently performs as well, as it puts your opponent on a very short clock, forcing them to respond. I mean, I think it has in the right hands, is a very favorable matchup versus Ruby Amethyst. Going into a field like that, I think it would be pretty well positioned to succeed. It can struggle with Steel, so maybe that's why people are shying away from it in the wake of the Steel Song lists that are coming out. But still, just surprised to see these 2 decks so lowly represented on here. But we'll go ahead and hop into the top 8 deck lists here. All right, we're going to start with the Amethyst Emerald list here from Corey Anderson. He does have his uninkables down at the bottom, which I do appreciate. I think most of the lists have them separated for the most part. Some interesting deck choices here. I do think, personally, playing a similar list to this in the past, that this is probably too high on the uninkable count for my liking. Not a ton off, so again, on a tournament setting, you can be very fortunate with this number of uninkables that it most likely won't cause you a problem. But at this number, just given enough games, you're going to start causing issues. And whenever you're playing these tempo decks, you really just want to try to minimize that risk as much as possible. I think for me personally, I'd probably either cut the Mother Gothels or the Genies, one or the other, just to kind of bring that count back down. Now, I did think it was interesting. He is playing Pascal and Olaf, but he is not playing any of the 2/2 for 1 characters for these two colors, the Archimedes or the Duke of Wesselton. And instead opted for the Befuddle package, which, again, I've talked about on this channel. I'm not a huge fan of this card. Again, especially not with all the other bounce that he has in this deck. It does seem to make, especially your Flynn Rider, much less effective when you're continually returning possible resources back to their hands. Because if you have deprived them of any kind of tempo from being able to ink a resource with this Flynn Rider trigger, you're basically bouncing it back to their hand with all this stuff here. So I don't like all of that bounce. I understand from a tempo aspect what they're trying to do, but honestly, this deck is built very much more mid-range control than it is early aggressive tempo. So I think it's an odd inclusion for me there. 4 Maleficent, 4 Friends on the other side, 4 Flynn Rider, not surprising. Cheshire Cat and 2 Hans, again, not surprising. Tinkerbell, only 3 copies of Jasper, which is fine. I think, again, I probably would just go ahead and max out the Jaspers here. He is playing John Silver at 3, which is fine. I do like this card. I like that he's starting to see some play now. I think he's going to see much more play in set 2. Having the ability to come into a play and immediately shut somebody off is nice, and then being able to quest and gain lore while effectively shutting off your opponent's ability to generate on one of their characters is very nice as well. Decent stats too for 6. He's playing 3 copies of the Megara here, which has been kind of a staple in like these green more aggro lists or these green more control lists rather that we've seen here recently. Just a way to kind of trade up, turn Pascals into the ability to take out Tinkerbells, etc. 4 copies of Mad Hatter, no surprise there. He's running 3 copies of Rafiki to help that early game against probably your more aggressive decks, or just the surprise factor. Now, I do find that I like Rafiki less and less, especially with the prevalence of the 2 control decks that are coming out. This card just seems to not really have much of an impact in those matchups, and being uninkable hurts that even more. I have cut this from most of my Amethyst list just due to that reason, it being uninkable and just not being much of a contributor, if at all, in those particular matchups. We've already talked about the Mother Gothels, and then the 4 Cuscos are pretty much a guarantee in most of these lists. 3 6-drop Genies. I will say, as a lot of 6-drops, having 6 6-drops in a deck, purple does have the extra card draw, but you're not guaranteed to get it. This number of uninkables combined with a lot of high cost in the deck could cause some issues for you, so just be cautious if you're out testing these decks. I would probably, again, we were talking about dropping the Gothel or the Genie. If we want to keep the silvers, the Genie's probably more likely to go in that situation. All right, the next list up here, the same color combinations, but a very different build. Much more aggressive build in this particular list. Running similar number of uninkables, but the 1-drop uninkables like Maleficents and Lilos kind of only count as like a half an uninkable, because generally you're going to play these on turn 1 no matter what. They only really matter that they're uninkable in like the later turns of the game when you don't want to play them. And even then, like, you still may want to play them just to tap and get the 2 lore once and then let them die, obviously. So, like, while they do count against your uninkable count, these 1-drops I don't really weigh as heavily as the higher stuff here. So realistically, we've got 10 uninkables in the deck, which is probably fine. Again, I do try to keep it on these more aggressive decks a little lower than that, but having Amethyst in the aggressive deck to help replace some of those cards is also going to help balance that out a little bit. So I think this is probably a fine breakdown. 4 Friends, 4 Maleficent, 4 Pascals, 4 Olafs, and then in addition to those, he's also running the 4 Archimedes and the 4 Duke of Wesselton. So again, very, very aggressive deck here, just loaded up with 1-drops. Then he's got Tinkerbells, Hanses, the Mad Hatters. He's got Mother Gothel in his list, opting for it over John Silver. I don't necessarily know that one is better than the other. I think they probably both accomplish very similar roles in either one of these decks. I mean, he's obviously got to wait a turn, but then can shut off his opponent's entire ability to quest that turn, whereas John Silver has an effect on 6, but it was only shutting down 1 character. I think they're going to accomplish very similar goals, so I can understand playing one over the other just depending on your particular play style. And then your Flynn Riders and your Cheshire Cats. So again, this is just a very, very aggressive list. Not a ton of surprises in this one. I would say with this many 1-drops, trying to find a spot for like Megara in the list might help as well. Just after, you know, cards like Olaf or Pascal past like turn 3 or 4, they're not really doing much. They're going to kind of secure that little early game lore. Past that, though, you're going to want to get into your 2 and 3 lore generators. So having something like a Megara to help these trade into something bigger a little bit later on may help. I'm not entirely sure what my first choice to take out would be. Maybe just one of the extra sets of these 1-drops, because I do think that 16 1-drops is a lot. But if you've got to hit something on one, this is a good way to guarantee that that'll happen. 20 1-drops with the Maleficent up there is probably a bit much. So I'd probably drop like the Duke or the Archimedes and try to work Megara in. All right, next up is a red-green list from Michael Leviak. And this list is a very surprising list for me. Now, his uninkables are pretty low. He has kept them at 9 uninkables, which again is about what I'd want to play for this range of deck. But right out of the gates, we're going to see a singleton copy of He's Got a Sword up here. Again, we're not playing colors that have a lot of card draw, so playing singletons at all is just kind of a weird choice to me. You're probably not going to see it in the few instances that it would be a relevant card, so it's just another inkable card, which is fine to run kind of a toolbox of inkable cards, but this isn't a super impactful one. So it could probably just be really any other inkable card that you're not running 4 of to make the consistent. So I think that was a little strange. Next up, we see 2 Sudden Chills. I am not a fan of Sudden Chill. It is no card advantage. And again, only running 2 copies of it means you're probably not going to see it in those instances where you really want to. It's not regularly, which is optimally when your opponent is down to like 1 card in hand and you can get that last card out of their hand with a Sudden Chill. Those situations do come up, but only running 2 copies in a deck with no card draw, you're probably not going to see it in those few situations. So I don't like the inclusion of these. Again, they're inkable, so I would imagine what they get 99% of the time is just put into the inkwell. 4 copies of Flynn Rider, 4 Duke of Wesselton, 4 Cheshire Cats. Some more interesting singletons. We have a single copy of Jasper, which is very surprising. He has been kind of a workhorse for Emerald here as of late. To run a singleton copy of him really doesn't make a ton of sense because he's not really a toolbox card. Like he's, a card that if you have him on 3, most games you're going to want to play him on 3. It's not like this deck has a ton of 3-drops he's competing for. It really just has the Cheshire Cats and then him. So odd inclusion at 1 of. Peter Pan as a 1 of. Again, I'm guessing just in there for the other evasive matchups to be able to challenge into like your Pascals. Again, though, if that's an ability you want, only having 1 of them in the deck, you're probably not going to see it in most of the situations you would actually want to see it in, and in all likelihood is just going to be inkable. More so than that he's got a sword, though. At least this one is a character with 1 lore generation, so he can get there if he needs to. 4 Tinkerbell, 4 Hans, no surprises there. 4 Pongo. And we have the 3 Goofies, which I think is fine. He does have a split between 3 Goofies and the 6-drop Tigger, which is a little odd. Not a huge fan of Tigger. Each one of these evasive characters just gets worse because they don't get any additional lore, and you really don't want to challenge except in the mirror matches. So that's really all you're paying the additional lore for is, Pongo you're paying this extra 5 because Goofy trades favorably into Pongo. And then over here you're playing an extra 1 because Tigger trades favorably into Goofy. And that's really it. That's the extent of their real usefulness for that additional 1. If you're not playing against, Pongos, Goofies, and other Tiggers, you're just paying extra for no reason. So I would tend to max out the Goofies before adding the Tiggers. But again, you're talking about a 1-card difference, kind of semantics at that point. 2 copies of Mother Gothel in the list. And we got 3 Mauis. Again, another odd choice. One of the best removal options that Red has. So not maxing out Mauis is an odd choice for me. Coming in at 5, taking a character out with him almost assuredly with that 6 strength that he has, and most times surviving to take out another character afterwards. Just very strong. 4 copies of Mad Hatter. And then we've got one of the more surprising options here in 2 Be Prepareds. Now, there is nothing in this deck that can sing this card, so this is going to be a full turn's worth of usage on turn 7. Without any card draw, playing a tempo deck like this one, it gets kind of hard to even get to your 6 drops consistently. I think getting to a 7 drop consistently is also going to be a challenge. And then again, only running 2 copies of this card, how many stars kind of have to align that you're able to get to 7, have a board state where you want to play Be Prepared, and then also have one of your 2 copies of Be Prepared in a deck with no card draw or any way to search it up. Now, obviously, he's won some games with this combination of cards. He got top 8 at this event. This just seems like a very inconsistent choice to be making, just given the circumstances. 3 copies of Dragonfire in perspective. Again here, not even maxing out the copies of Dragonfire. 3 copies of Cusco. Again, not maxing out the copies of Cusco, which is arguably the best character that Green has at their disposal, and only having 3 copies in it against a very heavy control meta that he was going into. And then 1, again, singleton copy of the Genie. There's a lot of odd deck choices here. I have a very similar list to this build. I did a video on a budget version of this list here. It can struggle, again, like I said, to get to these 6 drops. And he is running 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 drops and 2 7 drops in the deck. And just a ton of 5 drops in here as well. I don't want to be too critical on the deck. Obviously, I haven't tested this exact build, but just from what I have played with this color combination and the inability to draw or search up a lot of this toolbox, it does seem like a very specifically tuned deck. Just some very odd deck choices from outside looking in. All right, we have our very first Ruby Amethyst list from Kendall Burdett for the day here. This is a 60-card list running 15 uninkables, so pretty low on the uninkable side for the Ruby Amethyst build. This one is only running 60 cards though, so percentage-wise, it may be close to some of those that are running higher list counts. Rather than running more cards, this one is running a very heavy Mickey Mouse Magic Broom set, so they can use these magic brooms to cycle in their big threats, such as your Elsas, Aladdins, your Maleficents, etc. He is running 3 copies of the Pocket Watch, which tells me he's relying very heavily on these in those control matchups so that he can come in, remove a character with Maleficent and challenge with Maleficent in a turn. Singleton copy of Befuddle. Again, I've already touched on Befuddle. I think it's more of a negative tempo card than most people think, just due to the lack of card advantage. Decks like these, again, running this many uninkables to sacrifice an inkable card from your hand for temporary tempo is going to cost you probably more games than it's going to win you. I just don't like it. It's a singleton deck. It's really probably not going to make or break much of a difference there, but just as a general rule of thumb, I do not like this card. Archimedes, again at the 1-drop, 2/2 here. 4 friends, 4 queens. I have definitely come around to the 4 queens. I think I like her more in other Amethyst lists, other Amethyst control lists that can run fewer uninkable cards in their packages, just because getting to 5 with this many uninkables is pretty challenging. So a lot of times, like, you're just forced to ink the queen because she'll be one of the few, if only, inkable cards in your hand. Her, friends, or Maleficent, and usually I will opt to keep the card that draws a card immediately rather than the one that will draw one the following turn. 2 shields, 4 Maleficents, 2 Goofies here. Again, they're probably playing the Goofy over the Pongo because they're probably expecting to challenge opposing evasive characters with these. We've seen it some with like the inclusion of Jetsam in some lists that it's just really in there to challenge those early evasive characters. This one does have 2 Lord Generation though, so I do probably like this one because it can just shift into being a win condition for you in the right matchups. 4 Maui. 4 Gaston. We've got 4 of the big Aladdins with none of the smaller Shift Aladdins. I'm guessing he's just really putting an extra emphasis on that because of the White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. Still kind of have that surprise factor without the small Aladdins taking up space in your deck. Top end here, you have 3 copies of Elsa, no Ursulas in his list, 2 Magic Mirrors, 2 Rafikis, 4 Dragonfires, and 4 Be Prepareds. Rafiki, again, kind of in and out of favor depending on what you're seeing locally. Again, he's down to 2 copies there as well. These here, like I said, you're going to see some combination of Magic Mirror in most of these decks and some combination of Elsa in the deck as well. So no big surprises here. Probably most surprising thing is that it's only a 60-card build. Again, just more leaning on that Magic Broom package than going up in the card count. All right, so here's probably one of the most surprising lists here. Like I said, we talked about this color combination being the second most represented color combination of the tournament, but this is definitely not a list that I'm used to seeing in the top 8. This list is very, very different compared to most of the Amber Steel decks that I've seen. It is not the super aggressive Stitch Rockstar build, and it is not the more traditional Steel Song build either. Instead, this person is opting to go the bodyguard route, which I have not had much success with. It is a very fun deck to play, and a lot of people have built it and played it. I've not seen somebody do as well with it as Mr. Smith here, but kind of breaking it down very generally, he's only got 10 uninkables in the deck, and again, we don't count the 1-drop ones for full uninkable credit. So outside of that, you really got 4 copies of the Musketeer's Tabard, and then 2 copies of Grab Your Sword. Was surprised to not see the full 4 set of Grab Your Sword because that card is just really, really good. And he's got a decent draw engine in the 4 Rapunzels and then all the big bodies on the back end. So surprised to see that he didn't maybe take a chance with getting 2 more copies in there. Outside of that, we have 4 copies of LeFou, which again is just a very aggressive deck. Whenever you see cards like LeFou and the 2-drop Aladdin here, you know those decks are kind of all in the early game. And I'm guessing they're just looking to play down fast and early, and then hopefully continue to play bodyguard characters turn after turn after turn after that. We have our first bodyguard character in Simba. I'd say probably the best, definitely the best bodyguard character that we have so far, as a 2/3/4/2. Very few things can swing past him early game, so you can usually sit behind him for a turn or 2 sometimes even to get the generators going behind him. You have 4 Rapunzels to heal all these big willpower bodyguards back up. 4 Goofies, And for Maximus probably being our second best bodyguard character in the deck, his ability to quest and then jump any one of these little characters up to 4+ strength is huge. And we have our 2 copies of Captain Hook over here, just a way to slow those early aggressive decks down. Some favorable trades. Funnily enough, he could trade up to just about anything in the game with a Maximus support trigger on him as well. I already talked about the Aladdin, just kind of the inverse of the LeFou up here. 3-drop Hercules, obviously looking to transition from the Simba, or if we miss the Simba, have him down on 3 to take over our early game. 4 copies of Little Tink, obviously to get us to our Big Tink up here. 4 copies of Smash. 4 copies of Tabard. I mean, with this many bodyguard characters, I'm sure you're getting value out of Tabard, but he's literally playing every bodyguard character in these 2 colors. And I still don't know if this card's worth a spot in the deck. But again, if you're playing bodyguards and you're playing the Musketeers, like, why wouldn't you play the Tabards, right? Like, just thematically. Like, it feels like you almost can't build this deck and not have 4 copies of the Tabard in. My problem is the Tabard doesn't have an immediate effect. And honestly, you really need to have multiple Tabards in play before it's generating card advantage, because if you only have 1 in, it's only replacing the character that just died. So it's like a net. You lost a card, you get 1 card back. Now if you start getting multiples out, now obviously it starts to be like card advantageous and can really generate some other stuff. But then you're paying for in your turn most cases to do that. Like, I mean, you're talking about being at 6 ink before you could play the Tabard and play a bodyguard, which is just pretty unlikely at that point. Donald Duck at our 4 spot. He's got 4 copies there. Again, 2 copies of Grab Your Sword, 4 copies of the Big Musketeer, Mickey Mouse, and then one of the best steel cards that are out right now, 4 copies of the Big Tink. So, interesting deck. I'm sure most of us have tested a build very, very similar to this. Kudos to them for having success with it. I've not found a ton of success with these particular lists. Bodyguards, while they do help stop the challenges, a lot of decks right now are not challenging to control the board, opting to play cards like Grab Your Sword, Big Tink, Smash, Dragonfire, cards like that to circumvent. I mean, even the 4-drop evasive Tinkerbell gets around a lot of these bodyguards. So you have to have multiple bodyguards out to protect your small lore generators in the back from being challenged. I'm glad he did well with it. It's nice to see this deck getting some love, but also very surprised that out of all the Steel Amber lists that were there, this was the one that really rose to the top. Next one up is another Ruby Amethyst list. This one from Zan Said. This particular list is running 66 cards, if I counted correctly, and 21 uninkables, which is a bit high even for the extra cards in the deck. Again, the deck runs a lot of card draw, and cards like the Ursula's Cauldron will help smooth out some of those draws, but you also may just not get them. It has a very favorable mulligan in this game, but there's nothing to say that if you throw 5 uninkable cards back into the pile that you don't draw 5 more out of it. Again, it doesn't happen often, but this is a deck that really is trying to address everything your opponent can be doing. So if your opponent can keep you busy in the early game, it does limit your inkable options. 4 Maleficent, 4 Friends. He is playing 4 Brooms too, in addition to the 66 card count list. So he is banking on some mirror matches, which probably wasn't a bad call given what we saw in the initial breakdown. He's playing 2 small Elsas in the list. I do find that this card actually still has a lot of use just in and of itself rather than just a shift target, especially running cards like Maui, being able to tap down their Mad Hatter before they get to quest with it so that Maui can smash into it. Still very relevant. He is running 4 copies of Mickey Mouse Sorcerer as well, so again, very dedicated to the Broom package here. We have White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. He is actually running the Pocket Watch with the small Aladdins. So again, a little redundancy there. Not to say that that's the only target for White Rabbit's pocket watch, but it's the big one. I mean, Maui's already got Rush on him. Rafiki's already got Rush on him, and that's your big challenge targets outside of Aladdin until you get to like your Maleficent. You have the Queen at 4 of, Archimedes at 4 of, Maui at 4 of, Maleficent at 4 of. He's got a 3 and 3 split for the big Aladdin and small Aladdin. Honestly, with the pocket watches, I'd probably drop one of the small Aladdins and get the full 4 set of the big ones. That's really the one you want to draw. You don't really necessarily need to shift into him, especially since you'd have 3 pocket watches in the deck to already give him Rush. He's running 4 copies of Big Elsa, so maxing out the Big Elsas. Again, no Ursulas in this list. 4 copies of Rafiki, 2 Magic Mirrors, 2 Shields, 3 Ursula's Cauldrons. So he's got a 5, 6, 7 item set in this one. It's probably about, well, counting the White Rabbits, the inkable ones, we got a 10 item set. So that's about as many items as you're going to find in any one deck. And then again, these 8 cards here are going to be pretty standard in each one of the list. 4 Be Prepareds and 4 Dragonfires. All right, next Ruby Amethyst list up is from an Otis Turner. He's actually a local to this area here. He shops and plays in some of the local shops that we have around here. I have not had the pleasure of playing him in person, but we have had some discussions online, specifically around this deck. He is running a 70 card list here with 19 uninkables. So percentage-wise, it's a little bit lower on the percentage total. I am not a fan of running these higher end lists, but I do understand that this mirror match is an absolute nightmare. One of the biggest reasons why I will never be playing this list in a competitive environment is because I just can't stand the mirror match. They are boring. They are long, drawn-out games, and I do not enjoy them. Any deck construction to where I feel it's necessary that I have to run an additional 10 cards in my deck just to make sure I don't deck out versus the mirror, it is just not a deck that I want to be playing. But kudos to those who have been perfecting the list. I know he has been playing this list basically since it was a color combination to play. He's got 4 Archimedes, 4 Maleficent, 4 Friends, only running 3 Rafikis. He is running 2 copies of Jetsam and only 1 White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. With all the other evasive options that he has in the deck, I'm guessing these are really just in there as his removal options, trying to keep his Pongos and his Goofies for actually questing and not challenging if at all possible. The 1 White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. In a 70 card deck, only having a singleton one in there, you're probably not going to see it a ton of times, but I also find that it's not a card that you have to see in a lot of matchups. 2 copies of the Shield of Virtue. Again, pretty standard number of those. You know, a lot of times you end up inking one early and then having another one in the deck still to play later in the game. And again, if you're looking at the long mirror matches, it kind of helps prevent getting your threats taken out by their Mauis. Gastons, 4 copies of Gastons, 4 Pongo, 4 Maui, 4 Goofy, 4 Aladdin, 4 Maleficent. We have 2 copies of Magic Mirror, 4 Ursulas. So our first appearance of Ursula on here. Again, playing a 70 card list, having the extra card draw in there is going to be really, really helpful for consistency issues. Now, he's playing 4 of most cards in his list. So even at a 70 card list, with the extra card draw he's seeing, he's still probably going to see the cards that he needs to over the course of the game, and that Ursula is going to help make that happen. He's playing 3 copies of Elsa, and then, surprisingly enough, only 3 copies of the Dragonfire. I guess he didn't want to go to that 71st card. Again, this particular deck, removal is key to surviving a lot of the matchups. I think I would have found room for that extra Dragonfire. But again, he's tested this deck a lot more than I have. So if he felt 3 was the right number, I will concede to his preference on that particular one. For me personally, if I'm playing Ruby, Dragonfire is probably always going to be a 4-of. And then our last deck we're going to look at is another Ruby Amethyst list here. This one is another 70 card list. This one with 16 uninkables, which I think makes it our lowest percentage of uninkables for the Ruby Amethyst list. He is running 4 Maui. He's running 4 Small Aladdin, 4 Gaston. He's got 1 Taylor Mickey up here. Not a huge fan of singletons in a 70 card list, but if you're going to have a singleton, Brave Little Taylor is not a bad one to have. He's got 4 of the Big Aladdins, 4 of the Maleficents. He's actually running 3 of the Queens. I don't know why he has them broken up like that. So he's running 3 instead of the full 4 set. I do think 4 is the right answer right now, but again, the difference between a 3rd and a 4th is not huge. He is only playing a singleton of both of these items, which again, we talked about playing singletons in a 70 card deck. You're probably not going to see them in the scenarios where you want to see them. They're not actions, so they can sit out there, and even if they're not effective, I mean, if you play this on turn 1, it's probably going to sit out there most of the game. Unless your opponent just draws a ton of beasts, they're probably going to save them for your card draw ones. Same with White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. If you drop it down on 3, it's probably going to stay there most of the game. But again, only having singletons of them, I don't know how often you'll see them when in the matchups that you want them. For Maleficents, 2 Befuddles. We've talked about this card ad nauseum at this point in time. Again, I don't like them in the control list. I barely like them in tempo list. This card very infrequently does what I actually want it to do. It feels good when it resolves, but over the course of a long game, like the negative drawbacks for it, I think are just too high. We have 4 copies of Little Elsa, definitely the highest number of those I have seen in a while. Most people opting to either cut her entirely or cut her down to like a 2 of. So surprised to see her as a 4 of here. We've got 4 Friends on the Other Side, 4 Archimedes, 4 Be Prepareds, and 4 Dragonfires. No real surprise there. Still got 2 copies of Rafiki in the list. He is only running a 2-2 split of the Ursula and Elsa, with again some more singletons in his items. We've got Ursula's Cauldron and Magic Mirror. I know I've mentioned it already a couple times in this list. I just don't like singletons in 70 card list. There's a lot of singletons in here. Again, with the extra card draw, it does help the consistency. But for like Ursula's Cauldron, like you really want to hit that on turn 2. You're not probably going to be wanting to mulligan super aggressively for uninkable cards in a list that's running this many uninkables. So if it just doesn't show up in your opening hand, like it's really going to be diminishing returns each turn that you don't see it. And God forbid you draw it, on turn 7 when you're needing your 8 ink to play an Elsa, and that's the card you draw off the top. Again, will it work out more often than not? Probably, but I also just think it's a risk that, especially if you're going into a bigger tournament like this over the course of a long day, if it ruins one match, like that's one match too many. And I don't know that it's winning you enough games as a singleton copy in your deck to really be worth the risk of that happening.
So there you guys have it, the full meta breakdown for this 80-person event, including the top 8 deck list. Let me know what your favorite deck list was down in the comment section below. And until next time, guys, Hobby Hero out.